Some assume we live in the best of all possible timelines, as if our history has been progressing to some future utopia. It's perhaps why alternate history leans toward dystopias, but I personally think such an assumption is incorrect. Sometimes the wrong decisions are made, and progress is delayed or even reversed. Also, sometimes the wrong person is chosen to lead a country in a time of total war. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian, and today we asked the question, what if Charles Evans Hughes was elected President of the United States in 1916? Before we can answer that question, first we need to ask, who was Charles Evans Hughes? Well, in our timeline, he was a lawyer, a law professor, a governor of New York, a secretary of state, justice of the Supreme Court, and, most importantly for this video, the Republican presidential nominee in the 1916 election. He was known to be extremely intelligent, a prolific writer, had a photographic memory, and he was a great orator.
Rancor and bigotry, racial animosities, and intolerance are the deadly enemies of true democracy.
He even scored a 99.5 on the bar exam, which, as a lawyer, I have to say, is quite impressive. He was also known for being generous and kind, especially to his family. Nevertheless, he took his work very seriously and rarely bantered with others, which gained him the reputation of being cold and aloof. Hughes became famous for investigating corruption among public utility and life insurance companies in the state of New York, which at times even exposed the misdeeds of his own party. For his work, he received the Republican nomination of Governor of New York, and backed by every alternate historian's favorite American president, Theodore Roosevelt, he defeated the infamous newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst in 1906. As governor, Hughes championed several progressive reforms, including improving the working condition of laborers. He also appointed people by merit, even if it meant choosing Democrats. Others also found they couldn't persuade the governor by emotional appeals or promises of financial gains. Instead, he would painstakingly research every issue and decide the best course of action based on facts alone. Quote one New York politician, "You can't make any sort of trade with him. You can't approach him on the side of personal advantage. You can't seem to touch his political ambition. He is beyond me. The fool simply does right the whole time." Later, Hughes was appointed to be Associate Justice of the United Supreme Court by President William Howard Taft in 1910. While on the bench, Hughes voted to uphold workers' rights and the ability of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. He also voted to defend civil rights, including striking down several laws that discriminated against African Americans. Despite all of this, Hughes was considered a political moderate, since he believed things like corporations were necessary for the American economy, and also rejected other progressive proposals like equal pay for women, which made him unpopular with progressives like Theodore Roosevelt for not being progressive enough. According to Edmund in his book Theodore Rex, Roosevelt found Hughes to be intelligent but humorless and self-righteous, which caused Roosevelt to call him Charles the Baptist. In fact, Roosevelt's political infighting with Hughes while he was governor of New York was part of a widening split between the progressive and conservative factions of the Republican Party in the early 20th century. Meanwhile, events at home and abroad propelled Hughes to seek the White House. In 1914, the death of a certain Austrian archduke started a war in Europe that threatened to draw in America. Meanwhile, Roosevelt ran as a candidate of the Progressive Party in the 1912 presidential election, splitting the Republican vote between him and President Taft, allowing the Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson, to be elected president. Although a progressive himself, Wilson was also a Southerner and encouraged segregation in the federal government. In an effort to make Wilson a one-term president, Republicans offered the 1916 presidential nomination to Hughes, hoping that he could unite progressives and conservatives. After initially refusing to run, he accepted, becoming the first and only sitting Supreme Court justice to serve as a major party's nominee. Going into the election, however, Hughes had trouble winning over progressives because he opposed reforms like the 8-hour workday and the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which allowed for federal income tax. He did, however, support a women's suffrage amendment, the future 19th Amendment, which Wilson opposed. Nevertheless, Republicans in general didn't feel Hughes was an exciting enough candidate. Why does that last part seem so familiar? As can be expected, World War I was a major issue during the campaign. While most Americans were sympathetic to the Entente, they had little interest in joining the war. Wilson argued the U.S. shouldn't get involved, but Hughes, who kept a close eye on the war and once described Germany's war efforts as an onslaught on liberty and civilization itself, argued America should prepare itself militarily and economically in case they were drawn into the war, which didn't go over well with voters. Despite all of these handicaps, Hughes was still seen as the favorite to win, but he made a fatal mistake by snubbing Hiram Johnson, then Republican governor of California and Roosevelt's former running mate in 1912. While campaigning through California, Hughes failed to meet with Johnson. Angered by this, Johnson refused to give Hughes his full support, so when Election Day came, Hughes lost California to Wilson by 3,420 votes, which came as a shock to Hughes, who went to bed on Election Day sure that he would be congratulated for winning in the morning because of all the states in the populous Northeast and Midwest that went to him. Afterwards, Hughes supported Wilson when America declared war on Germany in April 1917. Later, he tried to work out a compromise between Wilson and Republicans over the League of Nations, specifically Article 10, which would have required America to go to war to defend fellow League members, but he failed. Hughes was again considered for the Republican presidential nominee in 1920, but the death of his daughter that year due to tuberculosis made him refuse to run. He was, however, appointed Secretary of State by President Warren Harding after he was elected in 1920. As Secretary, he was given a lot of autonomy, but failed to convince Harding or the Senate to join the League of Nations or the Permanent Court of International Justice. Nevertheless, Hughes did achieve some significant accomplishments, including appointing Charles G. Dawes to lead an International Committee of Economists to study lowering Germany's war reparations, which resulted in the Dawes Plan of 1924. He also refused to recognize the Soviet Union until they recognized property rights and other essential elements of capitalism, and he also helped establish a professional foreign service. Perhaps his greatest accomplishment, however, was the Washington Naval Treaty, or the Five Powers Treaty, of 1922, which limited the size and number of warships between the great powers at the time. Hughes resigned as Secretary of State in 1925 and would later be appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1930. His court opposed many of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs that were designed to combat the economic hardships created by the Great Depression, although Hughes did occasionally side with the government on cases. This led FDR to propose increasing the size of the Supreme Court in 1937, which Hughes worked behind the scenes to successfully oppose. Hughes retired from Supreme Court in 1941, having presided over the court's liberal shift and generally stayed out of the public light until his death in 1948. Despite his varied career, I think it'd be hard-pressed to find many Americans who would recognize the name Charles Evans Hughes, and if they remembered anything, it would be the court packing incident. And yet, maybe that is a tragedy in and of itself, because there are those who think Hughes should have won in 1916. Scott Bomboy of the National Constitution Center wrote an article about Hughes, calling him the man most qualified to be president who wasn't. David Frum, while writing for the Daily Beast, also considered Hughes as a president we should have had. And if all of that is true, what if Hughes beats Wilson in 1916? What happens next? Almost every source I read pointed to the missed meeting with Hiram Johnson as the reason Hughes lost. So let's assume Hughes, or someone working on his campaign, makes sure he meets with Johnson. The meeting goes well, and Johnson enthusiastically throws his support behind Hughes. This is enough to win California for Hughes, narrowly winning the Electoral College and thus the presidency, even with the lack of support from progressive Republicans. Meanwhile, having lost, Wilson would leave office early. You see, this was back when American presidents started their terms on March 4th instead of January 20th. This meant that there were several months America could have a lame duck president, which is not great for a country on the brink of war. So, according to author David Petrusa, while on an episode of C-SPAN's Presidential Contender series, if Wilson lost, he planned to appoint Hughes as Secretary of State, and then he and his VP would resign, which according to the rules of presidential succession at the time, would give Hughes the presidency before his term officially started. This means Hughes could prepare America for war earlier. Nevertheless, things wouldn't be easy for the new president. Congress would be in the control of the Democrats, so he may need to compromise on some issues. But as NPR reporter Andrew Snyder pointed out in his article on this very what if, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans, along with the Zimmerman telegram, where Germany offered to help Mexico reclaim the American Southwest, would force Democrats to back Hughes' proposal, including conscription and funding a massive naval buildup. So when America did declare war on Germany, either on April 2nd, 1917, or earlier, it would be better prepared to fight than it was in our timeline. But preparing for war is not the same as fighting it. So how would Hughes wage a war overseas in Europe? Well, in a speech given to the American Bar Association in 1917 about the war powers granted by the Constitution, Hughes famously said, "The power to wage war is the power to wage war successfully." This meant, in Hughes' mind, that in times of war, the Constitution gave few limitations on the executive branch's power to wage war. So President Hughes would have done everything not just to prepare for war, but to win it. For example, Hughes may have picked Major General Leonard Wood, who in our timeline was a former Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and commanded the Rough Riders with Theodore Roosevelt, as the leader of the American Expeditionary Force, instead of General John Pershing. In our timeline, Wood was the choice of Republicans to lead the AEF, and he also argued America should be better prepared for war. Perhaps Wood wouldn't have made the same mistakes as Pershing and order mass charges on entrenched enemy positions. Thus, a better prepared and led AEF would make a greater military contribution to winning the Great War than it did in our timeline, which would strengthen America's position at the peace negotiations. Other changes could include Hughes refusing to send American troops to intervene in the Russian Civil War, an event that hurt American and Soviet relations for years to come. Also, given Hughes' support for civil rights, along with reversing Wilson's orders to segregate the federal bureaucracy and deny high-ranking jobs to African Americans, he may have desegregated the army, which could have far-reaching consequences down the road. Still, even with all these changes, Germany and the Central Powers would still lose the war. However, Hughes would still have a big say in how the peace was won. For example, Hughes wasn't a foreign policy idealist like Wilson, so no 14 points or promises of leniency for the defeated Central Powers. Thus, Germany have fought longer in this alternate timeline, losing more battles even on German soil, which could have made it difficult for the German high command and nationalists to argue that the army had been stabbed in the back by civilian politicians and the Jews. So when an armistice is declared and the victorious allies meet to discuss peace, Hughes, backed up by a bipartisan delegation, given his reputation for picking people based on meritocracy over political affiliation, and without Wilson's health issues, he could probably keep France and Britain from exacting harsh revenge on Germany. Why do I think this? Well, I read an editorial in a December 1916 issue of Collier's Weekly, written by William Allen White, a newspaper editor and progressive leader. In his editorial, White lamented the fact that Hughes' time as a judge made him soft. Instead, as a judge, Hughes had to, and I quote, see both sides. He could have no clients. There was no one to fight for, nothing to defend. He had to look at things not as a partisan, but as a judge. Through sheer disuse, his combative mental organs atrophied and fell off. Teeth, claws, horns, hoofs all, his emotional enthusiasm to win for his client, oh, his joy in the chase and the flush of victory, everything but the calm, intellectual, judicial temperament were gone. Okay, I'll be honest, that does make Hughes sound like a bad politician. But benefited by hindsight like I am, that also makes him sound like the best person you want at a peace negotiation, right? With his experience as a judge, Hughes would have the temperament to listen to Britain and France's demands and be unmoved. I mean, Hughes had to deal with the big egos of law firm partners, Supreme Court justices, and Theodore Roosevelt, so I think he could handle David Lloyd George of Great Britain and George Clemenceau of France. Heck, he might even demand that Germany have a seat at the table, rather than to be dictated peace terms as it happened in our timeline. So what would this alternate peace look like? Well, Hughes may prevent the Entente from exacting harsh reparations on Germany. My guess is his reputation for intense research and relying only on facts would show him the poor economic outlook for Germany if reparations were or were viewed as too extreme by Germany, and how this might lead to a future war. He may even agree to forgive some of the war debt Europeans owed the U.S., which was a reason why the Allies demanded reparations from Germany, so that they could pay the Americans, in exchange for a smaller reparations amount from Germany. This means Germany could be economically better off post-war, which could keep political extremism at bay. Additionally, the threat of Bolshevism might be used to get Britain and France to back off from completely neutering Germany's military, by pointing out that they could be used as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Hughes may even refuse to include a provision giving Germany blame for the war, which might make other terms in the peace treaty, such as the loss of German territory in the east to Poland, the loss of Germany's colonies, or the inability to unite with Austria or other German-speaking lands, easier to stomach. And what about a League of Nations? Although Woodrow Wilson is given credit for creating our timeline's league, he wasn't the only person advocating for an international organization to maintain world peace at the time. Heck, he wasn't even the person who coined the name League of Nations. That credit goes to Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson, a British political scientist. So not only could an entity like the League still exist, but it might even have the same name. And as we know, Hughes wanted America to join the League, so if a League is still proposed, I think Hughes would support it, as long as there was no Article 10, which would make the organization more acceptable to Republicans. Thus, the United States would be a founding member of the League, making America a bigger player in foreign affairs in the post-war world. Nevertheless, even with these changes, the post-war situation would be far from rosy. For one thing, the Soviet Union would still exist and Stalin could still rise to power, with all the horribleness that implies. Also, Italy would generally be in the same situation it was post-war in our timeline, so Mussolini and his fascists may rise to power there as well. The French might also feel the peace wasn't worth the price and blood that they paid, so how politics turn out there could be frightening indeed. Also, no guarantee that a certain Austrian painter wouldn't find fertile ground to promote his ideology of hate in post-war Germany. As for Hughes, would he run again to be president in 1920? If the point of divergence butterflies away his daughter's death, he'd probably run for a second term. Whether he wins depends on how unpopular he was after the post-war demobilization and resulting recession. But given that the 1920 election would be the first one women were allowed to vote for the president, women voters might remember Hughes' support for women's suffrage, which could secure him a win. Assuming he does win, Hughes' foreign policy as president would probably be the same as he was as Secretary of State, but he worked more closely with the League of Nations. He also would have continued to champion disarmament, increase America's presence in Latin America, and work to decrease tensions with Japan and the Pacific. On the domestic side, he would have continued to fight against discrimination of African Americans, and may have been able to push through the Dyer anti-lynching bill in 1922, which would have made lynching a federal crime, something that didn't happen in our timeline until 2018. Several justices also left the Supreme Court during this term, which would have given Hughes the opportunity to fill the court with justices with similar views to his own. And what happens after Hughes leaves the White House? Well, he may have returned to the Supreme Court, assuming a Republican president nominated him, but he might have ended his career in the Permanent Court of International Justice, working to support the new world he helped create. Meanwhile, would the Great Depression, FDR's election, and the New Deal still happen as they did in our timeline? It's honestly hard to guess with any certainty at this point. But I can say one thing with some certainty. After all my research, I have to conclude Charles Evans Hughes should have been elected president in 1916. Hughes was a leader who had a chance to secure a better peace after World War I and improve race relations in America. But because Hughes wasn't enough like Theodore Roosevelt to impress progressives, and coupled with another man's bruised ego, America got an ill, overly idealistic segregationist as its leader, when it could have had someone who was way more qualified for the job. Still, while it's too late to change the past, hopefully Americans can learn from the election of 1916 and not make the same mistake in the future. Well, that's all I have to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.